Death interrupted, and the soul that came to demand the continuation of the ritual. Have you ever heard of someone who died in the middle of a ritual? What if I told you that years later, their own family began to dream about them, always at the exact same point where the ritual was interrupted, and that night after night, the spirit asked them to finish what they started? Today, you'll hear one of the most disturbing and moving stories we've ever told here, the case of the healer who returned from the afterlife to demand the final word on a spiritual work, a narrative of karmatic inheritance, portals between worlds, and the price of truth. So before continuing, leave the like to help this video reach more people and become subscribed to the channel, because here we uncover stories that mix mystery, spirituality, and that chill down your spine that you love to feel. The sky was overcast that night, as if nature itself sensed what was about to happen. João das Ervas, the region's most renowned healer, was preparing the most delicate ritual of his life, a ritual of spiritual liberation for a young man who, according to his family, had been cursed since birth. The small house smelled of burning herbs, melted wax, and smoke from a smoker. The floor of the terreiro was covered in lines drawn with pemba powder, ancient symbols that João knew by heart, passed down from generation to generation. The young man's family watched in silence, eyes wide. João recited soft words, almost a chant, rocking his body back and forth, as if sewing the invisible fabric between two worlds. The drum beat a slow, hypnotic rhythm, accompanying his voice until something began to change. The air grew heavy, the candle flames danced violently, and a cold wind blew through the house, even with the doors and windows closed. João broke out in a cold sweat. His voice began to falter, but he didn't stop. He was almost finished. The last words were the most important, for they would seal what had been summoned. But before he could speak them, João's body trembled. He put his hand to his chest, fell to his knees, and fell forward, his face against the floor of the terreiro. The drum fell silent. The candles extinguished at once, leaving only smoke hanging in the air. The young man, the target of the ritual, began to cry. The family screamed for help, but it was too late. João was dead. The ritual notebook remained open beside the body, João's bloodstain slowly dripping down until it reached the last line, interrupted mid-word. The house, previously filled with chants, fell into an unnatural silence. It wasn't the silence of any ordinary night, but a dense silence, as if something on the other side had become trapped. The burial was quick. João's body was laid to rest in the same terreiro, and many believed he had died of spiritual exhaustion, a kind of sacrifice to save the boy. But no one dared touch the notebook or erase the symbols on the ground. Some said that touching it would be disrespectful of what had been initiated. Others believed that completing the ritual without João would be dangerous, and so it remained. The blood-stained notebook was hastily stored in the attic. The terreiro was closed. But those present that night carried forever the feeling that something remained there, as if João's spirit hadn't completely departed. In the following months, anyone passing by the house at night swore they heard the distant sound of a drum. The kitchen light would turn on by itself, and sometimes a candle left in the oratory would burn down to the base in the morning, even though no one had lit it. João's wife said she felt the weight of someone sitting on the edge of the bed every morning shortly before 3, and somehow everyone knew the ritual wasn't over, and that sooner or later someone would have to pay the price for completing what João started. After the burial, João's house seemed suspended in time. For years, it had been the heart of the community. People always came to ask for blessings, prayers, herbal tea, or advice, but now the terreiro was closed and the front door rarely opened. The plants in the yard began to wither as if they, too, had felt the healer's departure. Silence was the new owner of the house. A silence that wasn't simply an absence of sound. It was dense, almost physical. João's wife, Dona Cida, said she felt this silence in her chest. like a weight that prevented her from breathing deeply. At night, the wind blew, but it wasn't the same wind that usually brought the smell of wet earth. It was a cold, still wind that blew through the cracks and made the candles go out by themselves, always at the same time. 3 a.m. Some neighbors, more superstitious, said it wasn't just mourning. They said João had died before completing something important, and that his spirit was restless, trapped in the place where the last word was never spoken. Others said the ritual he performed was one of spiritual liberation, and that when one dies in the middle of such a work, the door between worlds doesn't close completely. Dona Cida began to notice strange signs. The oratory in the living room, where João used to pray, would wake up with candle ashes on the floor, even though no one had lit anything. The old wall clock, which had been broken for years, started working again on its own and always stopped at the same time. 2:58 a.m. Minutes later, she could hear heavy footsteps in the hallway. Footsteps that didn't belong to living people. She tried to stay strong, but with each dawn, it became more difficult. The feeling of someone sitting on the edge of her bed became routine. It wasn't an aggressive presence, it was just someone who seemed to be waiting. Sometimes she thought she heard João's name whispered in the darkness, as if the torero itself were calling out to him. What had once been a home was now a vigil. Every object seemed to carry a memory. Every corner seemed to repeat the healer's last moment of life. The ritual notebook remained in the attic, untouched, like a forbidden object. But almost imperceptibly, the house began to respond. When Dona Cida thought about opening her notebook, a door slammed shut on its own. When she cried for João to rest, the smell of burning herbs returned for a moment, as if the house itself was saying, "It's not over." It was during this period that the rest of the family began to distance themselves. The children, afraid, stopped visiting their mother. They said the house had a bad weight, but this separation didn't bring relief. On the contrary, the silence grew even deeper. Dona Cida began to feel that she was not just dealing with her husband's spirit, but with something greater, something that connected his death to a work that needed to be finished, no matter the cost. The years crept by like a dense fog over the house. Dona Cida grew old there, alone, as the involuntary guardian of a secret she never dared touch. The ritual notebook remained in the attic, closed, as if holding a contained breath within. But then, something began to change. First came Pedro, the eldest grandson. He dreamed he was walking through the torero under a full moon, and saw his grandfather standing there, wearing the same clothes he'd worn the day he died. João was pale, but serene. Interestingly, in the dream, the torero was clean, with candles lit, and pemba powder creating perfect symbols on the ground, as if the ritual had resumed. When Pedro tried to approach, his grandfather raised his hand and whispered a single word, "Let's continue." Pedro woke up sweating, his heart racing. He didn't say anything the first day, thinking it was just missing his grandfather. But the following week, Ayla, his cousin, dreamed the same thing, and then another cousin. Until at Sunday lunch, they all realized they were having the same dream, with the same word repeated. The most disturbing thing was that each time they dreamed, the sensation became more vivid. The smell of burning herbs clung to their clothes upon waking. One of the cousins even felt ashes on his palm when he got out of bed. The younger children began crying at night, saying, "Grandpa John is calling outside." Dona Cida, who had grown accustomed to his silent presence, now began to fear something greater. It wasn't just her husband's soul that was manifesting, it was the ritual itself, calling for closure. She remembered his gaze on the night he died, determined, even as his body was failing him. He had promised himself to finish the job. Perhaps now he would hold the entire family accountable. The dream pattern intensified. In each dream, João seemed to draw closer. The first time, he was in the corner of the torero. The last time, he was already in the center, sitting exactly where he had fallen that night. And when Ayla dreamed again, she saw something even more disturbing. Behind Joan, a dark door slowly opened, and from it came a cold wind that blew out the candles one by one. It was at that moment that Isla woke up and, for the first time, spoke out loud to everyone. "If we don't finish what he started, something is going to come through that door." The words echoed in the kitchen, and for a moment everyone heard a sound that came from nowhere in sight. The sound of the drum that John was using, beating slowly. The message was clear. The ritual didn't just want to be completed, it needed to be completed. And now it wasn't calling just one person, it was calling the entire lineage. After the dream sequence, the family began to feel something stronger moving around them. The air in Dona Cida's house was different, not just heavy, alive. It was as if the very structure of the house was aware of everything that was happening. The doors creaked in moments of silence, as if responding to the thoughts of those inside. The lamps flickered whenever someone spoke about the ritual, and the old wall clock, which had stopped on the same day of Joan's death, started working again, but not normally. Now it stopped every day at exactly 3 a.m., as if in warning. It was on a rainy afternoon that Ayla, driven by a feeling she couldn't explain, went up to the attic. She found the wooden chest everyone avoided opening. The notebook was there, covered in dust, its cover stiff with age. When she touched it, a shiver ran down her spine. It was as if something had been waiting for just this moment. She brought the notebook downstairs and placed it on the kitchen table. The whole family gathered around in silence. The notebook was open to the same page as years ago, with Joan's bloodstains still visible. The last word written was incomplete. It ended in a dripping letter, as if the pen had fallen with his body. Pedro picked up the notebook and began reading the ritual instructions aloud. Each word seemed to echo in the air, making the windows tremble. It was as if the room itself reacted to his reading. When he reached the final part, his voice faltered. "There's a word missing," he said. It was then that they heard the sound. A cold breath passed through the house, and one of the candles in the shrine lit itself. No one moved. The smell of burning herbs permeated the room, mixed with the metallic aroma of blood. Ayla felt her grandfather's presence behind her, not like a frightening ghost, but like someone waiting. "He wants us to break up," she said, her voice firm. But the decision wasn't simple. Each family member was afraid to complete something they didn't understand. What if the ritual had consequences Joan couldn't foresee? What if opening the final word would also open the door Ayla saw in her dreams? Dona Cida wept. She said she carried the guilt of never having touched the notebook all these years, as if she had left her husband's spirit trapped between worlds. Pedro placed his hand on the notebook and said, "If we don't do this now, the next generation will carry this burden." At that moment, all the lights in the house went out at once, and the sound of footsteps echoed down the hallway. Not normal footsteps, but the same sound Cida had been hearing since Joan's death. It was confirmation that the decision could no longer be postponed. The legacy he had left behind wasn't just a house or a family name. It was an unfinished spiritual work. And now, that legacy demanded fulfillment. The rain that night seemed to accompany what was happening inside the house. The sound of water hitting the roof mingled with the creaking of the wooden floor, as if the house were breathing irregularly. Pedro lit a candle and placed the open notebook on the table. It was the first time in years that anyone had dared to read what was written to the end. The first few pages contained purification instructions, herbal baths, prayers, opening prayers. But as he progressed, Joan's handwriting became firmer, more urgent. There were drawings of symbols and notes in the margins, as if he had discovered something important during the ritual and needed to record it quickly. In the middle of the notebook, a sentence was underlined 3 times. The last word isn't just sound, it's delivery. Pedro felt a shiver. Ayla, beside him, ran her finger over the blood stain on the next page and felt that the paper was colder than the rest. It was as if that part had been preserved by another energy. When they reached the end, They found the word interrupted, a string of incomplete letters, as if the pen had fallen mid-writing. But what startled everyone was realizing that beneath it there was something new. Thin letters, written in different ink, almost like a message left after Joan's death. Whoever has the final say must offer something that cannot be taken back. No one understood right away. What did it mean to offer something irretrievable? Was it a sacrifice of life, of memory, of something material? The wind blew hard, extinguishing the candle for a second. When they relit it, the page had turned on its own, revealing an attachment no one had remembered seeing, a list of objects with notes next to each one. It described that the spiritual payment could be made with an object charged with ancestral energy, something that had belonged to the healer or carried the weight of the family's affection. Donatilla reached into her chest and pulled out a small leather pouch from under her blouse. It was Joan's amulet, which he had worn since he was young. She had never parted with it, not even after his death. The silence in the room became absolute. Everyone sensed that this was the object required for the ritual, but the fear was great. What if the offering released something that was trapped? What if, instead of sealing the cycle, it opened the door Ayla had seen in her dream even wider? Pedro slammed his notebook shut. He said they would need to decide together, but before they could discuss it, they heard the sound, the drum, coming from the yard where there was no one. The sound was slow, measured, but clear, as if someone were outside, marking the rhythm of the decision. The message was unequivocal. It was time to finish what was started. The sound of the drum echoed throughout the house, as if the yard had come to life on its own. None of them dared approach the window. The noise came from a place where no one was, but each beat felt like a call. Pedro felt that if they didn't respond, something worse would happen. The next morning, they gathered again in the kitchen, the table still open with the notebook. The scent of burning herbs seemed to have permeated the air. It was no longer a remnant of memory. It was recent, as if someone had prepared an invisible smoker during the night. If he died to save someone, we need to honor that, Pedro said, looking at each of them. If we don't finish, it's as if his sacrifice was in vain. Ayla agreed. She said the dream of the open door kept coming back, ever more vivid. Now she saw shadows trying to cross the threshold. If the ritual wasn't completed, something would pass through, and it wouldn't just be her grandfather's spirit. The discussion was long. There was fear. There was anger. Some wanted to call a priest. Others suggested burning the notebook. But deep down, everyone knew there was no choice. What was happening wasn't mere astonishment. It was a demand. That night, Pedro went to the terrero for the first time in years. He cleaned the space, swept the floor, and relit the candles. Each step was accompanied by a shiver that ran down his spine, but also by a strange sense of peace, as if someone approved of what he was doing. The notebook was placed in the center of the yard, along with Joan's amulet. Donacida, even with trembling hands, brought the same herbs her husband used. The children stood around, holding each other's hands. The circle was formed. The first part of the ritual was simple: opening, prayers, ancient chants, an invocation of protection. The house seemed to breathe with them. The candles burned with high flames, as if consuming something invisible. But when the time came to pronounce the final word, the fear returned. Pedro held the notebook and felt the temperature suddenly drop. A cold wind blew from inside the attic, making the pages turn on their own. And then they heard, all at the same time, a voice. It wasn't scary, but solemn. Whoever speaks the word must deliver what he keeps, without fear, without regret. Pedro looked at his grandmother. Donatilla clutched the amulet tightly, her eyes brimming with tears. That small object was her last physical link with Joan. Handing it over meant accepting that he was leaving for good. After a few seconds of silence, she knelt down, placed the amulet on the notebook, and said aloud, "Joan, if this is what you need to rest, it's here." A flash of light illuminated the yard for a moment, and the candle flames turned golden. The drum beat again, but now the sound was calm, like a slow heartbeat. Pedro took a deep breath. The moment to pronounce the final word was near. The night was so silent that it was possible to hear the rustling of leaves outside and the creaking of the house's wood, as if the house itself were preparing to watch. The terrero, clean and bright, seemed like another place. The lines of pemba powder traced symbols on the ground, just as João used to do, almost as if his own hand had guided Pedro as he traced the signs. The central candle was lit last. The fire rose high, illuminating João's notebook and amulet, which rested in the center of the circle. Pedro looked around. Everyone's faces were serious, some tense, others emotional, but no one seemed willing to back down. "Let's begin," he said, his voice steady despite his trembling hands. The first words were spoken in unison. It was as if each voice had been drawn from a place long ago, a collective memory spanning generations. The air grew heavy, hot, and a low vibration rippled through the ground, rising through everyone's feet. The scent of burning herbs filled everything, thick, almost intoxicating. As they advanced, the candles began to dance in time with the cadence of the voices. The wind outside died completely, and then the drum sounded. No one was playing, but the sound was there, deep, vibrant, like a heartbeat in the darkness. With each word spoken, something seemed to align. The shadows on the walls began to move, but not in a threatening way. It was as if João's own spirit were there, guiding every step. Donatida wept softly, but she kept repeating the words. Then something happened. The flame of the central candle split in two, as if cut by an invisible blade. The heat increased, and Ayla felt something whisper in her ear. "This is where he stopped." Everyone fell silent. The notebook was open to the page with the interrupted word. It was time to complete it. Pedro knelt, held the amulet, and closed his eyes. He began to pronounce the final word, but before he could finish, a gust of wind blew through the window and blew out 2 candles. The drum fell silent for a second, and then they heard the voice, clear, deep, coming from all directions. "Be careful. What has been opened cannot be closed twice." A shiver ran down everyone's spine. The warning didn't sound like a prohibition, but rather a warning that what they were about to do was final. There would be no turning back. Pedro took a deep breath and looked at his grandmother. Donacida nodded, telling him to continue. He then spoke again, with more force this time, and the pronunciation echoed through the yard like a suppressed thunder. The candles lit themselves again, and the drumming began again, faster this time, as if something were being summoned or released. The whole house vibrated. Even the windows rattled. It was as if, at that moment, the world of the living and the world of the dead were side by side, separated only by the thin line that Pedro had just touched when he pronounced the almost complete word. But the last syllable was still missing, and everyone felt at the same time that this last part would require more than just voice. It would require sacrifice. The wind suddenly died as if the world held its breath. The yard went still, and the candle flames froze in the air, erect, unwavering. A silence so profound fell over the house that even the sound of one's own breathing seemed to echo. Was at that moment that everyone heard it, not a sound coming from outside, but a voice within each of them, a firm voice without anger, but charged with an authority that could not be ignored. "You have brought light to what was left in darkness, but it is still not enough." Donacida pressed the amulet against her chest, tears streaming down her face. "What's missing?" he asked, almost voiceless. The notebook turned another page on its own, revealing something no one had ever seen before. A handwritten appendix, hurriedly written, as if it were an addition made shortly before João's death. It described what the ritual required to be completed, a spiritual payment, a voluntary giving of something that had profound value, something that symbolized life itself. The room grew colder. The shadows lengthened on the walls, and then the sound of the drum returned, this time slow like a heartbeat. The voice spoke again. "I don't want blood. I want truth." Ayla understood. This wasn't a physical sacrifice, but something more intimate, The ritual required someone to surrender a part of themselves that couldn't be retrieved, a memory, an object, a secret so carefully guarded that it had become part of the person's identity. Peter was the first to stand. He opened his backpack and took out a yellowed envelope. Old letters Jerome had written to him as a child. He placed them in the center of the circle. These are my memories of him. I've kept them since he was little. But if this is what will free him, let them be taken. The candle flame went out on its own. As if something had been accepted, Ayla approached. She picked up her diary, where she had written down every dream she had had since the beginning. It was her most intimate object. She placed it next to the letters. Me too. May my dreams become part of his path. Donacida hesitated. The amulet was still in her hands. It was her last physical link with João. But she knew she had no choice. With trembling hands, she placed it on the notebook and said aloud, João, you were my husband, my companion, my everything. If this is the last thing I can give you, may it go with you wherever you are. The candles lit into golden flames, and the drum beat 3 times, quickly, as if confirming that the offering was complete. It was then that his figure appeared, not as a shadow, but as a full, translucent, luminous form. His face was serene, his eyes filled with a peace he had not felt on the day of his death. Now we can finish, said the voice, this time with João's lips moving. The entire terreiro seemed to pulse, and everyone felt that this would be the most decisive moment of their lives. Pedro knelt and took a deep breath. Only the last syllable remained. But they knew that by speaking it, something would be sealed forever, and there was no going back. The terreiro was completely silent. João's figure stood in the center of the circle, his translucent body radiating a pale, almost golden light. It was the first time everyone could see him, not just feel his presence. He didn't seem like a ghost. He seemed whole, like someone who had waited years to be there. Peter knelt before him. The notebook, the amulet, and the letters lay on the floor, and the candle flames rose higher by the second, illuminating the room as if it were day. The drum beat, alone, but now it was faster, accelerating, like a heart about to burst. The incomplete word was there, before him. He just had to say it. But Pedro felt its weight like a mountain on his chest. He knew that last syllable wasn't just a sound, it was a choice, a door that would be opened or closed forever. "It's ready," said João's voice, calm but firm. Pedro closed his eyes. He felt the cold touch on his shoulder, an invisible hand, but real. And then, with all the strength of his voice, he finished the word. The instant the sound echoed, the candles burst into light. The floor vibrated as if the entire house were breathing for the first time in years. The wind invaded the courtyard, but it wasn't cold. It was warm, enveloping, like a hug. João's figure smiled. Slowly, he began to dissolve into light, as if every particle of his being were being freed. But before he disappeared completely, he spoke one last time. "The price has been paid, but the truth has its own path. Protect it." Then everything stopped. The candles went out simultaneously, the drum fell silent, and darkness fell over the house. For a few seconds, no one moved. It was as if they could still hear the echo of the word in the air. Suddenly, Ayla felt something warm trickle down her hand. It was a tear, but not hers. On her palm, a single drop of light glowed for a few seconds before disappearing. The ritual was complete. But the feeling that remained wasn't just relief. It was something greater. That by completing the final word, they not only freed John, but also made a pact that would be passed on. The spiritual inheritance was now sealed, and nothing would ever be the same again. The next morning, the house was different. The air felt lighter, as if someone had opened all the windows during the night and let the wind purify each room. Donatida woke up without the feeling of heaviness in her chest for the first time in years. When she got up, she went to the yard. Everything was intact, but the notebook was no longer on the floor. She found it in the oratory, closed, its cover clean and free of the bloodstain. It was as if it had been restored by invisible hands. Opening it, she found something new written on the last page in handwriting identical to John's, but impossible to have been written by human hands. The word has been spoken, the door has been closed, but there will be others. She felt a shiver, but not of fear, of reverence. She put the notebook back in the trunk and locked it, knowing it was now a sacred object, a link between what was and what was to come. In the following days, life seemed to return to normal. The dreams ceased, the drumming was no longer heard, and the feeling of being watched disappeared. The children returned to playing in the yard, and even the neighbors commented that the house felt more alive. But on the third night, Ayla dreamed again. This time, she didn't see her grandfather or the yard. She saw a long hallway with several closed doors. At the end, one of them slowly opened, and a golden light emerged. Upon waking, her heart raced, and at the same moment, she heard a soft sound coming from the backyard. It wasn't the drum. It was something different but equally hypnotic, a sound of light bells that rang by themselves in the breeze. Pedro entered the kitchen and found something on the table, Joan's amulet. It had disappeared during the ritual, but now it was there, clean, shining in the morning light. Touching it, he felt a shiver and heard a low, almost maternal voice. "Now it's up to you." He understood. The ritual was over, but the spiritual work was not. John might be free, but the link to the unseen world remained alive in the family line. It wasn't a curse, it was a calling. That night, Pedro sat alone in the terrero, gazing up at the starry sky. He held the amulet in his hands, silent. He knew that sooner or later another ritual would be necessary, and that perhaps he would be the next to fall to his knees before the mystery. But for the first time, he felt no fear. He felt that the house, the notebook, and the very blood of his family now carried a mission to keep the doors between worlds open only when necessary. And deep down, he knew the doors would move again. And when that happened, the sound of the drum would return. End, or the beginning of a new cycle, because some stories never really end. And so, the ritual was finally completed. But the last message left by John showed that this story may not be over. The door was closed, but others may open. And now I want to hear from you. If it were your family, would you have the courage to finish what you started, or would you leave the past behind? Right here in the comments. I read every single one. If this video gave you goosebumps, leave it like so that more people know this story. Share with those who like spiritual mysteries. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel to follow the next reports that we will bring. Who knows? The next story may be even darker.